Our next speaker is Doug Wiebe. He's a professor of epidemiology in the Department of Biostatistics, Epidemiology, and Informatics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the director of the Penn Injury Science Center and directs the Ivy League Big Ten Epidemiology Study of Concussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Doug Wiebe.
Steve Broglio, Rebecca Cunningham, and the organizers, thanks so much for the chance to be here. Stellar epidemiology professor and mentor Zach Kerr, thank you for that plug and for teeing this up. Delighted to be here. What I will talk about today is the origins and the activities of the Ivy League Big Ten Epidemiology of Concussion study, and present to you a summary of findings that have come from the study to date, and a brief overview of some of the analyses that are currently ongoing. There is so much to work with here. It's a very exciting study with a lot to offer and advance the science of what we know about student health in the context of TBI and varsity athletes. So here to set this up for you and inspire next discovery. The origin of this group was in 2012 when the TBI research collaboration got together and was organized by the Big Ten Academic Alliance. It includes 22 institutions, and the goal is to increase collaboration and discovery around sport-related concussion. And it was around the same time in the Ivy League when the presidents became highly motivated, in part from, over the previous 5 years, 2 tragic incidents of suicide among varsity football players at Penn, who had each experienced concussion. And then also a visit and a talk from Malcolm Gladwell, who of course was very well attended and suggested that perhaps varsity football is too dangerous a sport and shouldn't be happening. The presidents of the Ivy League were very motivated to understand what is the context of concussion in Ivy League football and also across the rest of sports in the Ivy League. And so they wanted to start counting cases. What happened was, quickly, what was launched was a surveillance study of sport-related concussion across all sports in the Ivy League, followed very shortly thereafter by schools in the Big Ten joining. And looking back now 6 years ago, this is a very large, robust, actively recruiting surveillance system for sport-related concussion across many institutions, and also a prospective cohort study for each case that is identified. Student athlete who sustains a concussion. They are enrolled and followed forward in time for a number of key outcomes. And participation has been outstanding. We think that is largely thanks to very hands-on awareness raising by athletic trainers and engagement by trainers with their athletes to encourage participation. So we're able to look at the demographics, the epidemiology, the time course to recovery for concussion, and as Zach has described, athletic exposure data. For many contact sports, we're also collecting data on how much time athletes spend exposed to be able to calculate rates. So participation so far, all 8 Ivy League institutions are participating, and 11 of the Big Ten institutions are participating. We're in conversations with the few remaining to bring them on board in upcoming years. And as for findings, what we call the big paper, paper number 1, which was actually paper number 3, but took the longest to get out, was published just this April in American Journal of Sports Medicine. And we use that as a chance to describe the origin of the study, the nuts and bolts and the operations of the study, the motivation for the study, and then first findings in very high-level epidemiology so that future papers can refer back to this and cite it and go on to study more specific topics. So a few findings from what we reported here. For many contact sports, I mentioned that we collect exposure data. Here you can see that that's enabled us to calculate rates overall for sports and then also in competition and in practice. And we've sorted these in decreasing order in overall rates, with the highest being in women's lacrosse, football, women's soccer, men's lacrosse, women's ice hockey. That's a decreasing order of concussion rates overall. The next thing that really jumps out on these graphs is that the gray bars are longer than the white bars, and gray bars are rates of sport concussion during competition. Zach mentioned this too. Rates are higher during competition activities than practice. Remember what's underlying that, there are more concussions happening, same here for us in these leagues, more concussions happening during practice than competition just because more time is spent there, but the rates are higher in competition. And you see by far highest rates happening in wrestling, football, and women's soccer and women's ice hockey. For us too, measuring exposure in something like wrestling is a real challenge, but these are the rates that we're finding across these different sports. We've averaged only the most recent 2 years here. You will see that, in fact, we're able to calculate rates over 6 years for overall surveillance of trends. Something else that we've reported so far, we've honed in on sports where rules are comparable by gender and have reported the incidence and prevalence of symptoms. Like with so many other studies, what is administered for this work is the SCAT, the 22 symptoms. And here we show basketball, men and women, soccer, men and women, and simply symptom prevalence to just have a first look at the prevalence of these symptoms and any differences that may emerge by sport or by gender. One bottom line, when you draw the line in the middle, athletes are endorsing 7 symptoms, so half of athletes said they have 7 or more symptoms, half said 7 or less, and when we split it at the median, in fact, we find that a greater proportion of men, 78% versus 69%, are experiencing 7 or more symptoms. You'll see that this gives us a real chance to look at sex differences that Chris Giza teed up a little bit, and I'll show you a bit more about how we're looking more closely at that. But here it's more men than women reporting a higher number of symptoms, even though there are so many hypotheses and some evidence that for a given blow, women may be more likely to sustain a concussion, may experience worse symptoms, and may be slower to recover. We'll continue to look further at that. So regarding recovery, high-level findings here, when we split athletes at the median in terms of 7 or more symptoms or 7 or fewer, not surprisingly, those that were more symptomatic took a longer time to recover and have their symptoms resolve. Some good news here, so often when we talk about concussion, we end up speaking as if we're talking about the average athlete and how it may be over 2 weeks. Most athletes don't feel well. The good news is maybe about 3/4 have their symptoms resolve in about 2 weeks. Here it's important, we see, to split out those who have the lowest number of symptoms, and among those who were least symptomatic, we see that the median time to recovery was actually 3 days. Half of those athletes were asymptomatic within 3 days, so that could be very reassuring when managing athletes and evaluating them and thinking about their potential prognosis. High-level stuff here, just teeing it up for future analyses. Also, symptom resolution by gender, not controlling for previous number of concussions, for concussion severity, for sport played. Just first pass at this. These are symptom resolution over time, over at least 3 months. And we see that the median number of, or median days to symptom resolution was almost equal, 8 for women and 9 for men. So no meaningful difference here. And the other outcomes that we have are time to return to academics, time to return to full exertion, and then to full competition. And we see men and women on average being equal in time to return on each of these. All right, that's first pass stuff. And to step back, with this study, we also are able to calculate rates over 6 years for high-level surveillance and look at changing trends over time. You'll see that we can do much more than look at high-level trends. We have enough data now to really dig into some sports and some different play types even, and look at the incidence and rates of concussion in different contexts. To date, as of Tuesday, there are 2,717 cases. The majority of those are sport-related concussion, but a nice thing that this surveillance does is also track non-sport related concussion. And these 390, that accounts for about 15% of cases. About 15% of the cases that we're enrolling in the Ivy League and the Big Ten are athletes injured outside sport-related activities. We collect some nice narrative information to understand the context that was happening there. Some are activities of daily living. The narrative is that I woke up abruptly in bed and hit my head on the upper bunk. There's a great overrepresentation of motor vehicle crash or being on a scooter and crashing. And alcohol seems to be involved in a lot of the non-sport related concussions. So there are certainly opportunities for prevention there. This is preventable. And of course, sport-related, just like sport-related concussion, takes athletes away from school, away from sports, and is most immediately an impact on their health. So we can work on prevention there too. The majority of cases have been in the Ivy League. They've been participating longer. And in both the Ivy League and in the Big Ten, it's about 2/3, 1/3 counts more women than men as far as cases in the database. Football is a big driver for that. And you'll see that the axis has been kind of jiggered here. Don't know how to go backwards, but there were 616 concussions among men, so that bar really went way off to the left of the slide, and we just brought it back so that you could see counts by other sports. Oh, that was backwards. There you go. All right. So that all was reported in what we called the big paper that we put out in April. More analyses to come and are ongoing. As you can see, we can look at the epidemiology of concussion, report out with so much data, average findings for women and men across many sports on what we're observing in terms of time to different types of recovery, and also look at mechanisms of injury and much more, as I'll show you a little bit. A major aspect of this concussion consortium that so many people are so excited about is that it's a tight-knit group of people ranging from the presidents of these academic institutions to the athletic trainers and data coordinators working to collect data comprehensively and are motivated to make varsity athletics safer. And a great example of this, and a real public health success story, is seen in the Ivy League. And it was in 2015 when the coaches of football got together and said, we have a hunch that disproportionately during kickoff returns, we are seeing concussions happen, and we ought to try to do something about that. And they suggested making a move. They suggested moving the kickoff line 5 yards forward and the touchback line 5 yards back. And we're hoping to inspire more kickers to make it into the end zone, to inspire a touchback, and more kickoff receivers to take a knee and not run back and have high-speed impacts by both teams running against each other. Bernadette Delonzo and I, research coordinator, joined the study in 2 years ago when this endeavor was in year 4 and learned about this and pointed out, that's a fine natural experiment that just happened. Have you evaluated it? And in fact, Carolyn Campbell-McGovern at the Ivy League had taken a first pass at analyzing the data. Everyone had a hunch that this worked, and we looked at the data with a more sophisticated epidemiologic method and reported that last October in JAMA. And here's what we found. We calculated rates of concussion during kickoff returns before and after the rule change. Enough time had passed so that we had 2 years post-intervention. And what we found was that the rate of concussion during kickoff returns really plummeted from 10 per 1,000 to 2 per 1,000. So that's a major decrease over time. That itself was encouraging and is evidence that maybe this worked. Now, this is a natural experiment. It wasn't controlled. There are many other moving parts out there, and it begs the question, what else might have happened in between that could have been driving this? Nothing major in terms of rule changes happened as far as our leadership in the Ivy League could tell. As far as things that we might not be able to measure or know about, we wanted to have a control group. And the counterfactual for this was concussion rates in non-kickoff return plays. And you can see that those decreased a little bit from 2.5 to 1.8, but taking that little difference out of the big difference leaves us with a difference in differences analysis and evidence that 7.5 fewer concussions occurred per 1,000 runbacks, kickoff returns, after versus before the rule change. So that was a really nice success story with pretty sound evidence that it worked. Carolyn Campbell-McGovern took the findings to the NCAA, and in fact, the NCAA rolled out a new version of this rule change across the entire all conferences to try to make the game safer. We reported that. Being in JAMA, it got widely disseminated. And just to tell you a little bit more about public health success stories, evidence like this is so important. Rebecca described that Rebecca Cunningham at the Injury Center, is the director of their CDC-funded Injury Control Research Center. I'm the director of the ICRC that we have at the University of Pennsylvania. And directors of injury centers visited Capitol Hill and went to a Hill Day this spring, talked to members of Congress about the need for further funding in injury science, such as this work. And a major topic of conversation was the results of this study, which the CDC has posted on their website as a public health injury prevention success story. I think that really got picked up because concussion resonates with people. It's easy to talk about. People understand football. People are worried about concussion. And bottom line, the House Appropriations Committee put out its proposed budget for the year and had money, continued funding for injury control research centers, and in fact, $2 million additional dollars dedicated to support research on the prevention of injuries in varsity athletics, which is a big deal. It is hard to have federal budgets changed to work on injury prevention science. So this is really nice wraparound, I think, that started with the coaches saying we need to make a change, and then evaluating it and finding evidence that, in fact, this seems to have worked. So everyone's very pleased about that, and that's really nice to be able to report. More analyses that are underway to dig into these data a little bit deeper. One thing that we're looking at is further the issue of sex differences in symptom profiles and time to recovery. And it's Bernadette who's leading this analysis. So I mentioned that all athletes are administered the SCAT. They're administered each of these items on the 0 to 6 scale, but our trainers are collecting them only in terms of yes, no. One reason they're doing that is that they are asking athletes right at baseline and evaluating them on symptom count and symptom severity, but then also asking over time, did you ever endorse any of these symptoms? So we're collecting them yes, no. At a high level, women and men are endorsing on average 11 symptoms, women endorsing 12, which is really about the same. And we went further to break those symptoms into CDC recommended categories. And they really fall into 4. You can count those 22 symptoms as either being somatic, cognitive, emotional, or sleep. And so what we've done here is look at survival curves, time to symptom resolution, in women on the left or men on the left and women on the right, and looked at time to symptom resolution among those who were high on one of the domains versus low. And not surprisingly, those who are more symptomatic, i.e. endorsed a higher number of symptoms, took longer to recover, and in many cases it's a twofold difference, twice as long to recover if they were highly symptomatic on a given domain versus less symptomatic. This inspires us to think about how when we look at further analyses, we really do need to control for symptom severity and maybe symptom type. We'll look more at that. Here's the factor analysis that Bernadette went on to do to not just lump factors according to these recommended groups, but to let groupings play out by just looking at the data and doing so separately in women and men. That is, for men who sustained a concussion, if they experienced pressure on the left, what else did they experience? And most athletes who were male who endorsed pressure also said they felt slow, they felt foggy, they don't feel right, can't concentrate, fatigue, and drowsiness. So that is how groggy and foggy manifested in men. It manifested a little differently in women. Look at their factor number 1. Slightly different in what they experienced. Emotional, women experienced don't feel right, emotional irritability, sadness, and anxiousness kind of all together. For men, it was all that stuff without don't feel right, which we think is a weird one. We'd love to talk with the athletic trainers what they think about their athletes telling them, what does it mean to not feel right? And the only one of these symptom types that really was equal in terms of what loaded on it was the third one in the middle, dizziness. So some slight differences in how women and men are experiencing the bad stuff that they're feeling after they sustain a concussion. For men, we looked at those 5 symptom domains and said, is a given man high or low on what they're feeling? High or low on grogginess, high or low on emotional, high or low on sleep difficulty. And we did that also for women. We split them into high or low on each of those 5 domains. That gives us 2 to the 5. It's 32 different options for what a given athlete may be experiencing in terms of, you guys help me. Is there a pointer on this thing? No. Oh, okay. I'm not going to press the other 3 buttons. High or low, you see where the little red arrow is. What that top grouping is, it says that 10% of men were 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, were low, 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 low on each of those 5 things. So 10% of men had that type of concussion. Low on symptomatic, low on foggy, low on groggy. And down at the very bottom, for example, 9% of men were high, 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 high on all those domains. But you see represented among men every possible combination of being high or low on that stuff emerged. Kind of consistent when you say, when you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. A whole different schmozzle of different domains and experiences that are being manifest in these athletes. And the same for women, ranging across the whole gamut. Were there any implications for the type of concussion symptoms that were being experienced and time to recovery? Here we see the first 3 for men, and indeed those who were more foggy were slower to recover than those who were less foggy. But look at the bottom. For women, being foggy was even more detrimental. There's even more of a spread between those who were high versus low. So stuff to dig into here and classify patients according to the type of symptoms that they have and severity to better understand potential timeline to symptom resolution. The last one, head pain, in both women and men, didn't seem to differentiate between those who would versus would not take a long time to recover, but sensitivity and headache did split people apart. So something to look at there further. And to step back again, if we don't control for symptom type and we just look at all comers, men versus women, it looks like they take the same time for symptom resolution. So great need to look beyond and classify according to type. Going to dig in just briefly here and zoom in on football. And here we see on the left time to symptom resolution for football versus non-football male athletes. They didn't seem to differ in the timeline to symptom resolution. If you look at time to return to full play, however, men in football were getting back faster to full play than men who were playing other sports. So maybe evidence that there's not much that can be done about accelerating athletes to feel better faster, but along the full return to learn, return to exertion, return to full play protocol, maybe athletic trainers are able to do things to get them back to full play faster. This is all just preliminary and all can be looked at further. Last one on this symptom stuff, but if among women and men we identify only the sickest of the sick, those that endorsed at least 4 of those 5 symptom domains, and we look at only those 700 women and those 700 men and 460 women, have a look at this. Among men and women who experienced the most symptoms, time to return was slightly slower in women than in men. 2-day difference, statistically meaningful, probably clinically meaningful. If that makes the difference between getting back for the weekend to play versus having to wait for the next week, that is all sport types. Come back to men and look at football versus others. On the left, that's time to symptom resolution. Men playing football versus other men, no difference in time to symptom resolution. They're not feeling better faster than one another. But on the right, you see time to return to full play, and what a difference. Median time to return to full play was only 16 days among men playing football, who were the sickest of the sick. Compared to men in other sports, it took over 3 weeks, 24 days. So perhaps there is insight that working diligently along the return to play, return to full, and return to learn protocol is working. All right, so much to discuss there. Going to switch gears and look at just one last piece of this return to play protocol. Thank you. And one question that is asked that is administered to each athlete by the athletic trainer, or just asked of the trainer, is to think back on this athlete and tell us, did the student progress, yes or no, through the return to play protocol as expected? And of 1,500 sport concussion cases, in the great majority, it was 84%, the athletic trainer thought, yes, this went as expected. What does that mean? Well, we're able to look at that. Instead of just looking at time to symptom resolution, time to return to exertion, time to return to full play, we can look at these things in conjunction with one another. Here along the bottom, you see days to symptom resolution, and going up, you see days to return to exertion. And each of these blobs is a group of athletes. Bigger blobs, more athletes. Athletes falling right on the diagonal mean that they returned to exertion on the same day they had their symptoms resolve. And look up at the top. 27% of cases fell into this category. So they got back to exertion on the same day they had their symptoms resolve. Interesting. Above the line is where most of the dots fall. It's 2/3. 2/3 of athletes returned to exertion only after they became symptom-free. It's only 9% of cases that returned to exertion before symptom-free. Zach asked, and for the people remotely, Zach said, how many of you are athletic trainers? And almost everybody in here raised their hand. Athletic trainers, the athletes that you treat with a concussion, how many of you are encouraging them to get back to a bit of exertion, even before they're feeling asymptomatic? Maybe half, maybe a little bit less than half. Chris Giza put up evidence from John Letty that emerging evidence that maybe some physical exertion could be helpful on the pathway to recovery. Much more to learn, but if that's the case, we would want to be seeing a lot more red dots below this line. This gives us a chance to look at these in conjunction with one another. That is all sports, male, female. Here is football only, and we see very much the same pattern. These are the same percentages, so same thing that we're seeing in football. That was symptom resolution versus time to exertion. Here's symptom resolution versus return to full academics, with most of the green dots falling below the line. What we're seeing is that most athletes are getting back to academics before they're getting back to exertion, or before they are asymptomatic. We may be concerned that some cognitive exertion before feeling better could slow down their recovery. At the same time, we know that it's very anxiety-provoking and difficult for athletes to be away from the classroom. So we can look at these in conjunction with one another. Symptom resolution versus return to full play. Good news is that very few among 1,200 cases, 1% of athletes got back to full play before their symptoms resolved. So that is good news. And again, following the return to play protocol, there were no athletes who went straight back to full play without first getting back to some exertion or to limited play. So that is very good to see. Zach described that athletic trainers there's evidence of them being able to very validly collect data, but it's very hands-on to do that. We have a protocol and an app that we're using with John Letty now in a randomized trial of exercise where we're using it to follow athletes in real time and report back to the provider how the athlete is feeling on a given day. In part there, it's a safety check to identify adverse events. We published the protocol and evidence that this works well in JAMA Pediatrics, and we're also using it in some other contexts. We're interested in seeing if we could roll this out in the Ivy League and Big Ten schools, if it could be useful. You can read more at recoups.net. And there are many next steps that we can do here. Zach described the value of surveillance, and beyond that, I'd like to point out that in these athletic conferences where everybody is game to try to make sports participation safer, I think there's no reason why we might not even move into randomized trials. For example, there's a lot of excitement around the VISIS helmet, thinking that might be increasingly protective. If a given team only gets a handful of VISIS helmets, and we're really in equipoise, we don't know that they could be better, we could start randomizing and then really evaluate whether those are protective against concussion. And in the big picture, we hope to bring more funding to this endeavor. It's funded by the presidents of the Ivy League and the Big Ten. We'd like to bring larger federal funding to this to increase the acceleration of discovery from the data, and also bring in more trainees like Bernadette. We're thrilled that Abby Breslin, remotely at Michigan State, who's completing her Ph.D. at Michigan State, will be joining us at Penn this summer as a postdoc, and we want to be able to further support future scientists to do this kind of work. That's our group. Thanks so much to the athletic trainers as well, and all the leadership, and again for the chance to be here. All right.